At 76, one of Hollywood's most iconic leading men lives in exile. Not in disgrace, not in failure, but by choice. This is a man who made the world fall in love with Pretty Woman, who commanded screens for decades as the embodiment of charm and desire. A global sex symbol who could have had anything. And yet today, he's banned from the world's largest market, estranged from the industry that made him a star, and living in the streets of Madrid with 2 toddlers. But here's what makes this story truly shocking. He orchestrated his own exile. While other actors chased billion-dollar franchises and bowed to studio demands, this man walked away. He chose a Tibetan monk's advice over a movie mogul's money. He traded red carpets for refugee camps. And when the industry told him to stay silent or lose everything, he spoke louder. But the cost? Hollywood essentially erased him. Major studios stopped calling. Blockbuster roles vanished overnight. An entire country banned his name. And at 73, while raising infant sons, his body nearly gave out completely. Yet somehow, this exile discovered something Hollywood never offered: peace. How does a restless kid from a small town of 5,000 people become one of the biggest stars on the planet? What drives a man to sacrifice everything the world values for something most people can't even see? Why would someone choose principle over profit when the price is total exile? And how do you find purpose when the very system that built you tries to bury you for speaking truth? Before we answer, we need to go back. Because the man who would reject Hollywood's throne was searching for something else entirely, long before fame ever found him. Richard Tiffany Gere was born on August 31st, 1949, in Philadelphia, but his real childhood unfolded in Syracuse, New York. A small town of barely 5,000 people, with one movie theater aptly named Hollywood. It was an ordinary place for an extraordinary restlessness. His father, Homer George Gere, was an insurance agent, but everyone in Syracuse knew he was more than that. Homer had once dreamed of becoming a Methodist minister, and though he never wore the collar, he carried that calling into everything he did. When neighbors had problems, they didn't call City Hall. They called Homer Gere. He sold insurance, like a man protecting souls, not just property. I grew up in a Methodist house with deeply compassionate people, Richard would later recall. His mother, Doris Ann, was a homemaker who filled their modest house with music and warmth. Richard was the second of 5 children, the eldest son, and from the beginning, he was different. Not rebellious exactly, but searching. The Gere household was musical: piano, guitar, trumpet. Richard played them all. He excelled at gymnastics too, his body as disciplined as his mind was restless. At North Syracuse Central High School, he was the kid who could nail a trumpet solo and then execute a perfect vault in the gym. He graduated in 1967 with a gymnastics scholarship to the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he chose to study philosophy. Philosophy. Not business, not medicine, not anything practical. Philosophy. He carried Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness under his arm. I'm probably reading only one chapter, but needing the world to know he was asking the big questions. What is existence? What is reality? What is being? For a kid from Syracuse, these weren't academic exercises. They were survival. Like most young people, I wasn't particularly happy, he admitted years later. I often asked, "What's this all for?" The Methodist faith his father embodied with such grace somehow didn't fit. It was beautiful, yes, compassionate, certainly, but it didn't answer the questions burning inside him. So Richard read. He devoured everything. Bishop Berkeley's subjective idealism. the crack in the cosmic egg, anything that challenged assumptions about reality itself. And then, in his early 20s, he found Buddhism. At first, it was Zen. He studied under Kyozan Joshu Sasaki, sitting in meditation in a cramped New York apartment for months at a time, doing Tai Chi, trying desperately to quiet the noise inside his head. "I was holed up in my apartment for months," he remembered, "just doing my best to do sitting practice. I had a very clear feeling that I'd always been in meditation, that I'd never left meditation. It was as if he'd come home. But college felt like a cage. After 2 years, he dropped out. No degree, no backup plan, just a burning need to act. His father must have been bewildered. All that promise, all that talent, and his son was walking away to chase a dream in the theater. Richard moved to New York City in 1969 and began working at the Seattle Repertory Theater and Provincetown Playhouse on Cape Cod. His first major role was in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. It was professional, but barely. He was sleeping in his car between gigs, scraping together rent, auditioning for anything. In 1973, he landed a breakthrough role in the original London stage production of Grease. Not the sanitized movie version America would later love, but the gritty, raw theater production. He was Danny Zuko before John Travolta ever slicked back his hair. And people noticed. Then came 1978, the year everything changed. Not because of fame, though that was coming, but because Richard traveled to Nepal with Brazilian painter Sylvia Martins. There, in the shadow of the Himalayas, he met Tibetan monks and lamas who spoke a language his soul recognized. And then he met the Dalai Lama. "That meeting changed my life," Richard would say decades later. The spiritual leader gently challenged everything Richard had learned about acting. The Stanislavski method, which taught actors to feel the character's emotions, seemed absurd through a Buddhist lens. Emotions hold no intrinsic value. The Dalai Lama laughed at the idea that anyone would work so hard to manufacture anger, hatred, and suffering. Richard became a practicing Tibetan Buddhist, specifically of the Gelugpa school. Not casually, not as a celebrity affectation. He walked across Tibet as a pilgrim. He practiced in remote mountain monasteries. A Methodist boy from Syracuse, descended from Mayflower pilgrims, had found his true lineage in the teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. And yet, even as his soul found peace, his career was about to explode into chaos. By the late 1970s, Hollywood came calling. Small roles at first. To looking for Mr. Goodbar in 1977, where he played a drug-addicted pimp in just 15 minutes of screen time. But those 15 minutes burned into people's memories. Then came Days of Heaven in 1978, directed by Terrence Malick. Critics raved. And in 1980, American Gigolo made Richard Gere a star. "I had never seen my name so big on a marquee," he remembered. "Then 3 of my films opened back to back, and I literally woke up famous. It was thrilling and terrifying." The 1980s didn't just make Richard Gere famous. They made him a phenomenon, a sex symbol, a leading man whose face sold magazines and whose name guaranteed box office gold. But for a man who spent hours each morning in meditation, seeking detachment from ego and desire, the irony was almost unbearable. American Gigolo in 1980 transformed him overnight. He played Julian Kay, a high-end escort navigating the dangerous glamour of Los Angeles. The role was electric, erotic, unapologetic. Audiences couldn't look away. Suddenly, Richard Gere wasn't just an actor, he was a fantasy. 2 years later came An Officer and a Gentleman. Opposite Deborah Winger, Richard played Zach Mayo, a troubled Navy recruit who finds redemption through discipline and love. The film grossed nearly $130 million, won 2 Academy Awards, and cemented Gere's status as one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. He earned his first Golden Globe nomination. But the rest of the 1980s proved treacherous. Film after film failed to capture that same magic. The Cotton Club, King David, No Mercy. Projects that seemed promising on paper but crumbled at the box office. Critics began to question whether Gere was a genuine talent or simply a pretty face trading on charisma. Behind the scenes, the tension was even greater. Richard was actively practicing Buddhism, meditating for hours, studying with teachers, and increasingly drawn to activism. In 1987, he began speaking publicly about Tibet and the Chinese government's brutal occupation. It wasn't casual celebrity advocacy. It was personal. The Dalai Lama had asked him to help. "I had no interest in talking publicly about Dharma, about my Buddhist practice," Richard admitted. "It was too important to me, too private." And then His Holiness said, "We need help." So he spoke. And Hollywood began to turn its back. China represented enormous financial potential for studios. Billions of dollars in box office revenue, production deals, and distribution rights. And here was Richard Gere, one of their biggest stars, publicly calling the Chinese government thugs and oppressors. Studio executives were furious. In 1993, at the Academy Awards, Gere was asked to present. Instead of simply reading names from a teleprompter, he used the global platform to denounce China's human rights abuses. The backlash was immediate. He was banned from ever presenting at the Oscars again. The major studios began quietly shelving projects with him attached. "I think my politics regarding China have made me unwelcome within Hollywood," Gere would later say with calm acceptance. "But I don't regret it for a second." Yet even as his career cooled, his personal life heated up. In 1988, at a barbecue hosted by celebrity photographer Herb Ritz, Richard met Cindy Crawford. She was 22, a rising supermodel with voluminous brown hair and an iconic smile. He was 39, a Hollywood veteran nursing career wounds and seeking something real. Despite the 17-year age gap, the chemistry was instant. They bonded over Buddhism, meditation, and a shared desire to escape the superficial chaos of fame. They traveled to India and Nepal together. They meditated side by side. To the world, they were the ultimate power couple of the early 1990s. Beauty, talent, success. But inside the relationship, cracks were already forming. Cindy was young, eager, and willing to mold herself around Richard's interests. In the beginning, when you're a young woman, you're like, "You like baseball? I like baseball. You're really into Tibetan Buddhism? I'll try that," she recalled years later. You're willing to kind of mold yourself around whoever you're in love with. Richard, for his part, was older, established, and perhaps less willing to compromise. He had spent years defining himself outside Hollywood's expectations. Marriage felt like another cage. According to reports, Cindy eventually gave him an ultimatum. "This woman, who I was crazy about and loved very much, said, 'I can't wait. I gotta move on if it ain't happening,'" Richard admitted years later. So in December 1991, they eloped to Las Vegas. A spontaneous ceremony at the Little Church of the West. Aluminum foil rings. Dinner at Denny's afterward. It was meant to be romantic, spontaneous, real. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. The tabloids had a field day. Rumors swirled that both were hiding their true sexualities, that the marriage was a sham, a publicity stunt designed to protect their careers. The whispers grew so loud that in May 1994, Richard and Cindy did something almost unprecedented. They took out a full-page ad in the Times of London defending themselves. "We got married because we love each other, and we decided to make a life together," the statement read. "We are heterosexual and monogamous and take our commitment to each other very seriously. There is not and never has been a prenuptial agreement of any kind. Reports of a divorce are totally false." The statement backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing the rumors, it amplified them. If everything was fine, why were they protesting so loudly? By December 1994, their publicists announced they were separating. The marriage had lasted 4 years. Cindy later opened up about what went wrong. "We didn't spend enough time together," she told People magazine in 1995. "We thought it would be okay if we just flew in from Paris to Los Angeles to get together for a night to see each other." It wasn't. But the deeper issue was the power imbalance. I think part of the problem was that we were a lot of other things, but I don't know if we were ever friends, like peers, Crawford admitted on Mark Maron's WTF podcast in 2016. "Because I was young, and he was Richard Gere." She described how, as she approached her 30s, she began to find her own voice and power. "Your 20s for women is such a time where you're starting to come into your own and feel your own power," she explained. "And it's hard to change in a relationship because what one person might have signed up for, all of a sudden you're not that anymore." Richard had wanted someone who would follow. Cindy had grown into someone who wanted to lead. The divorce was finalized in 1995. They remained respectful, but distant. "We're friendly. But I think it's almost like he's gone back to being Richard Gere again, like a stranger," Crawford said years later. Yet even as his marriage crumbled, his career found unexpected resurrection. In 1990, just as his personal life was fracturing, Pretty Woman exploded into theaters. Opposite Julia Roberts, Richard played Edward Lewis, a wealthy businessman who falls for a prostitute with a heart of gold. The film earned $463 million worldwide and earned Gere his second Golden Globe nomination. Hollywood had tried to exile him. The public welcomed him back with open arms, but Richard Gere was learning a brutal lesson. Fame and principle rarely coexist peacefully, and the price of speaking truth was only beginning to reveal itself. The divorce from Cindy Crawford in 1995 left Richard Gere facing an uncomfortable truth. Hollywood's success and personal integrity were on a collision course, and he was about to choose integrity. Throughout the late 1990s, while other actors chased franchises and blockbusters, Richard doubled down on the very activism that was making him unemployable. He co-founded Tibet House United States in New York. He became chairman of the board of directors for the International Campaign for Tibet. He didn't just write checks. He showed up. He traveled to refugee camps. He met with exiled Tibetans who had fled Chinese persecution. He listened to stories of torture, cultural genocide, and families torn apart. And then he came back to America and spoke about it, loudly. And the Chinese government's response was swift and absolute. Richard Gere was officially banned from entering China. Not just discouraged, banned. His films were blacklisted. His name became radioactive in the world's largest emerging market. And Hollywood, always following the money, took note. "Major studios wouldn't touch me," Richard admitted years later. They'd be polite about it, of course, but the message was clear. If you want access to China, you can't work with Richard Gere. Projects that seemed certain collapsed overnight. Roles he was perfect for went to other actors. Producers who once courted him stopped returning calls. By the late 1990s, Richard Gere found himself in a strange position. Still famous, still talented, but effectively exiled from the system that had made him a star. See, lesser men might have apologized, walked back their statements, played the game. Richard Gere embraced his exile. "I don't regret it for a second," he said flatly. "The Dalai Lama asked me to help, and that's more important than any movie role." Shut out of mainstream Hollywood, he turned to independent cinema. And something unexpected happened. He found the best work of his career. Films like Arbitrage in 2012 showcased a depth and complexity that blockbusters rarely allowed. As corrupt businessman Robert Miller, Richard delivered what Rolling Stone called an implosive tour de force. He earned his 4th Golden Globe nomination and reminded critics that beneath the sex symbol was a serious actor who had been waiting decades for material worthy of his talent. But before that renaissance, there was stillness. And in that stillness, Richard found something he hadn't expected: love again. In 2000, he met Carrie Lowell, an actress and former Bond girl who had appeared in License to Kill. She was intelligent, grounded, and 15 years his junior. Unlike his marriage to Cindy, this relationship felt different. Less performance, more partnership. On February 6, 2000, their son was born, Homer James Jigme Gere. The middle name, Jigme, was Tibetan, chosen with the Dalai Lama's blessing. At 50 years old, Richard Gere became a father for the first time. "Everything changed," he said quietly. "You think you understand love, and then you hold your child." He and Carrie married in 2002, and for a while it seemed Richard had finally found balance. A family, a spiritual practice, work that mattered, or even if it wasn't blockbuster-sized. And then came Chicago. In 2002, at 53 years old, Richard was cast as Billy Flynn in the musical film adaptation of Chicago. He had to learn tap dancing in his 50s to keep up with Catherine Zeta-Jones and Renee Zellweger. The film was a massive critical and commercial success, earning 13 Academy Award nominations and winning 6, including Best Picture. Richard won the Golden Globe for Best Actor in a Musical or Comedy. After years of being shut out, dismissed, and blacklisted, here he stood, holding a trophy for playing a sleazy lawyer who sells justice like it's entertainment. The irony wasn't lost on him. "I've always been drawn to flawed characters," he reflected. "Maybe because I understand that nobody is just one thing, and we're all contradictions." Chicago could have been a comeback, a return to A-list status. But Richard didn't want that. He had tasted independence and found it more nourishing than fame. He continued choosing projects based on artistic merit, not box office potential. Shall We Dance? In 2004, where he revisited childhood ballroom lessons under Jennifer Lopez's direction. I'm Not There in 2007, an experimental Bob Dylan biopic. Arbitrage, Norman, The Dinner, films that challenged him, that asked difficult questions, that refused easy answers. But his personal life was fracturing again. By 2013, after 11 years of marriage, Carrie Lowell filed for divorce. The proceedings were long, painful, and ultimately finalized in 2016. Court documents cited lifestyle differences, but those who knew them understood. Richard Gere was not an easy man to be married to, not because he was cruel or unfaithful, but because he lived with one foot in the material world and one foot in the spiritual. His mornings began with hours of meditation. He disappeared for weeks on retreats. His closest advisor was a Tibetan monk, not a Hollywood agent. "Practice was always my real life," he had once said, and Carrie, like Cindy before her, found herself competing with something she could never fully understand. The divorce left Richard with shared custody of Homer, a deep well of regret, and a growing understanding that perhaps traditional marriage was incompatible with the life he had chosen. He threw himself deeper into activism, not just Tibet now, but human rights globally. So he supported Survival International, fighting for indigenous tribes. He campaigned for AIDS awareness. In 2010, he spoke out against the invasion of Iraq with a frankness that made publicists wince. Nixon said he was no liar. Clinton said he never had sexual relations with that woman. Bush said he knew where weapons of mass destruction were, Richard said at a press conference. Respected presidents could easily win any international contest for liars. He wasn't trying to be provocative. He was simply incapable of pretending anymore. Hollywood executives watched with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. Here was a man who could have had anything: money, power, adoration, and he kept choosing the harder path, the lonelier path. With age, I've become more outspoken, Richard admitted. And maybe because I've realized I have less time to waste on politeness. He was banned in China, but welcomed in India, where he meditated in ashrams and met frequently with the Dalai Lama. He studied Kabbalah for a role in the hoax. He learned everything he could about every character, not to disappear into them, but to understand them completely. By his mid-60s, Richard Gere had become something rare in Hollywood. A man whose career was defined not by what he said yes to, but by what he refused. He refused to apologize for his beliefs. He refused to prioritize profit over principle. He refused to pretend that Tibet didn't matter, that human rights were negotiable, that silence was acceptable. And Hollywood, unable to control him, slowly let him go. But Richard Gere was about to discover that exile wasn't the end of his story. It was simply the clearing of space for something he never saw coming. A love so unexpected, it would redefine everything he thought he knew about family, purpose, and home. In 2014, Richard Gere was 65 years old. 2 failed marriages behind him. A son, Homer, now a teenager navigating his own path. A career that had been quietly brilliant but commercially marginalized. And a spiritual practice that demanded hours each day. Most men his age were contemplating retirement, grandchildren, slowing down. Richard Gere was about to fall in love again. Her name was Alejandra Silva. She was 31, a Spanish publicist and activist with dark hair, bright eyes, and a passion for social justice that matched his own. They met through mutual friends, both navigating the end of previous relationships, both carrying wounds they didn't quite know how to heal. The age gap, 33 years, should have been insurmountable. The tabloids certainly thought so. But when Richard and Alejandra spoke, and something deeper than attraction ignited. They shared values. They saw the world the same way. They both believed in using privilege for purpose. "We're like soulmates," Alejandra would later say. "We have the same values. We see the world in the same way. And from the first moment we felt that we had known each other for a long time." Richard was more cautious, having been burned twice before. But there was something about Alejandra that felt different. She wasn't molding herself around him like Cindy had. She wasn't struggling to understand his spiritual life like Carrie had. She simply met him where he was, completely, without reservation. "I wasn't looking for this," Richard admitted. "But sometimes life gives you exactly what you need when you stop chasing it." They dated quietly, at first, away from cameras and tabloid speculation. And they traveled together. They meditated together. Alejandra already had a son, Albert, from her previous marriage to businessman Govind Friedland. And Richard watched how naturally she balanced motherhood with her activism work. In 2018, they married in a private ceremony. No Vegas chapel this time, no aluminum foil rings. Just quiet vows exchanged between two people who had both learned that love is less about passion and more about partnership. And then, at 69 years old, Richard Gere became a father again. Alexander was born in February 2019. Photos showed a silver-haired Richard cradling his infant son with a tenderness that seemed to transcend time itself. Here was a man who had played romantic leads opposite the most beautiful women in Hollywood, who had commanded stages and screens for decades, reduced to pure wonder by 10 tiny fingers. "My priorities changed completely," he said softly. "My world suddenly wasn't about films or awards or anything else. It was about him." But the universe wasn't finished. In April 2020, during the height of the global pandemic, Alejandra gave birth to their second son, James. Richard Gere was now 70 years old with 2 children under 2. Friends worried it might be too much. The sleepless nights, the endless energy required, the sheer physical demands of parenting toddlers when most men his age were playing golf. Richard had never been happier. "People ask if I'm too old to be a father," he reflected, "but I think I'm finally the right age. When Homer was born, I was still figuring out who I was. Now I know. And then I can give these boys something I couldn't give before: presents." Every morning began not with meditation alone, but with breakfast chaos. Pancakes burning, toys scattered, 2 little boys demanding attention with the kind of beautiful tyranny only toddlers possess. And Richard, the man who had once commanded $10 million per film, crawling on the floor building Lego towers. Alejandra watched her husband transform before her eyes. The restlessness that had haunted his earlier relationships seemed to evaporate. He still practiced Buddhism daily, still spoke out on Tibet and human rights, still chose independent films over blockbusters. But now, everything orbited around family. "He's the most present father I've ever seen," Alejandra told friends. "When he's with the boys, nothing else exists." In interviews, Richard spoke about fatherhood at 70, with a clarity that comes only from experience and perspective. "I thought I understood love with Homer," he said. "But having children at this age, when you know how fragile life is, when you understand how quickly time passes, it changes everything." He and Alejandra raised the boys bilingual, speaking both English and Spanish at home. They kept their lives remarkably private, shielding Alexander and James from the paparazzi circus that had consumed Richard's earlier relationships. Rare photos showed a family walking beaches in Malibu. Richard in simple clothes, no pretense, just a father holding his son's hands. But even as they built this life in California, Alejandra felt the pull of home, Spain, her family, her culture, the roots she had left behind to be with Richard in America. "To New York gets in your blood," Richard told Jimmy Fallon in late 2024. "It's very hard to remove that. It infects your DNA. But I love Spain too. I love Madrid. And it's time for my wife to be around her family and friends and culture." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "And good for our kids. I think it's great to be living, not just visiting, but living in another culture." The decision was made. In November 2024, Richard Gere, one of Hollywood's most iconic leading men, left America. He sold his Connecticut estate for $10.75 million. He packed up his family, Alejandra, Alexander, James, and Albert, and moved to Madrid. Hollywood barely noticed. The industry that had once defined him had long since moved on. But Richard didn't care. "My kids are bilingual, so they're going to flourish there," he explained. The move wasn't retreat. It was evolution. In Spain, Richard discovered something he had never truly experienced in America: anonymity. In Madrid, he could walk the streets without being mobbed. He could take his sons to parks without cameras following. He could simply be Alejandra's husband, Alexander and James's father, not Richard Gere, the movie star. "We are happier than ever," he told Elle España in January 2025. "She, because she is home, and I, because if she is happy, I am happy." It was perhaps the most Buddhist statement he had ever made. The dissolution of self into the happiness of others. The recognition that individual joy is inseparable from collective well-being. Friends from his Hollywood days called occasionally, asking when he was coming back. And some projects still trickled in. He had recently filmed The Agency for Showtime, appearing alongside Michael Fassbender. But these were increasingly rare. "I don't need to be everywhere anymore," Richard said quietly. "I just want to be there when the boys laugh." At 75, having spent 50 years in the entertainment industry, Richard Gere had finally found what he had been searching for since that restless teenager carried Sartre under his arm in Syracuse: peace. Not through meditation alone, though that remained central. Not through activism, though he never stopped fighting for Tibet. Not through fame or fortune or critical acclaim. Peace through surrender. Through choosing family over legacy. Through understanding that the greatest role he would ever play required no script, no director, no audience. Just showing up. Every single day. For two little boys who didn't care that their father was once the sexiest man alive. They just wanted him to play. February 2023. Richard Gere was on vacation with his family in Nuevo Vallarta, Mexico. Sun, sand, and the simple joy of watching Alexander and James play in the waves. It should have been paradise. Instead, it became a terrifying reminder of mortality. Richard fell ill suddenly. What started as a cough escalated rapidly into something far more serious: pneumonia. At 73, with two young children depending on him, pneumonia wasn't just an inconvenience. It was potentially catastrophic. He was hospitalized immediately. Alejandra stayed by his side, fielding worried calls from family, managing the boys' fear, and confronting the possibility that her husband, 33 years her senior, might not recover. For days, Richard fought. Fever, difficulty breathing, and the kind of vulnerability that strips away every carefully constructed identity until all that remains is the raw animal instinct to survive. "I thought about the boys constantly," he admitted later. "Not my career, not my legacy, just whether I'd get to see them grow up." Alejandra later reported that he had fully recovered, but those close to the family saw something shift. Richard returned to health, but he returned changed. More aware, more careful, more conscious that time, which had always seemed infinite to a movie star, was actually running out. Back in Madrid, he adjusted his routines. Daily meditation remained, but now it was accompanied by doctor's visits, health screenings, dietary changes. The body that had once performed its own stunts, that had learned tap dancing in its 60s, it was now simply trying to keep pace with two preschoolers. Friends noticed he moved more slowly. His energy, while still remarkable for 75, wasn't boundless. He napped when the boys napped. He declined late-night events. He chose presence over performance in every decision. "People don't realize that being an older father isn't just emotionally different," he told a close friend. "It's physically demanding in ways I didn't anticipate, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." The pneumonia scare also forced him to confront questions he had been avoiding. What would happen to Alejandra and the boys if he died? Homer was now an adult, 24 years old, and beginning to follow his father into the entertainment industry. But Alexander and James would barely remember him if he died young. Estate planning became urgent. Legacy, not in the Hollywood sense, but in the practical sense. How do you protect your family when you might not be there to do it yourself? And yet, even as his body reminded him of its limits, Richard's principles remained unyielding. In February 2025, he attended the Goya Awards in Granada, Spain, where he was honored with the Goya International Award for his humanitarian work. Standing on that stage, he could have simply thanked the Academy, waved, and sat down. Instead, he used the platform to speak truth. We're all part of a universe of overlapping pain and sadness and joy, he began, his voice steady but weighted with years of observation. I see this world that we're in now, forgetting that. This very foolish tribalism is starting to take us over, and where we think that we're all separate from each other. Then he turned his attention to American politics. We're in a very dark place in America, where we have a bully, a thug, who's the President of the United States, he said, referring to Donald Trump. But it's not just in the United States, it's everywhere. Authoritarianism takes us all over. The statement made international headlines. Some praised his courage. Others accused him of being out of touch, privileged, and performatively political. But Richard, who had been banned from China for decades for similar statements, was long past caring about backlash. If you have a platform and you don't use it for what matters, what's the point? He said simply. The cost of that philosophy, however, remained real. He was still banned from entering China. The films he might have appeared in went to other actors because studios couldn't risk alienating the Chinese market. Projects that would have been greenlit with a more compliant star were shelved. At 76, Richard Gere was essentially unhireable by major Hollywood studios, not because he lacked talent, but because he refused to be silent. I've been exiled from the industry that made me, he acknowledged, but I chose this, and I'd choose it again. His recent work reflected that exile. The Agency, a Showtime series produced by George Clooney and Grant Heslov, was one of the few high-profile projects he accepted. Playing Bosco, a London station chief with a storied past, Richard brought decades of lived complexity to a character haunted by the choices he'd made. I don't get offered superhero movies, he said with a wry smile. But I get offered characters with depth. And honestly, that's always been more interesting to me. The physical changes of aging were impossible to ignore. His hair, once dark and thick, was now silver white. Lines creased his face, not from cosmetic procedures or artificial preservation, but from 76 years of living. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who understood his body's limitations. In public appearances, the transformation was striking. The sex symbol of American gigolo was gone, replaced by something more dignified, more weathered, more real. Some tabloids cruelly highlighted the contrast, publishing side-by-side photos, Richard at 30 versus Richard at 75. But Richard seemed genuinely unbothered. I'm not trying to look 40 anymore, he said. I'm trying to be present for my kids. But that's all that matters. Still, there were moments when mortality whispered louder than he could ignore. Watching Alexander and James play, he calculated the math. If he lived to 85, they would be 15 and 16. Barely old enough to remember him clearly. If he lived to 90, they'd be young adults, and he might attend their graduations, maybe even their weddings. But there were no guarantees, especially after pneumonia. I think about it sometimes, he admitted. Not morbidly, but realistically. I want to give them as much as I can while I'm here. That urgency shaped everything. He recorded videos of himself reading stories so the boys could hear his voice long after he was gone. He wrote letters they would open at milestones, 16th birthdays, graduations, weddings. He documented family traditions, recipes, jokes, all the ephemera that makes a person knowable to those they leave behind. Alejandra watched this preparation with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. He's not afraid of death, she observed, but he's terrified of them forgetting him. And yet, even facing his own mortality, Richard continued to speak out. In interviews promoting wisdom of happiness, his documentary about the Dalai Lama, he framed it as medicine for difficult times. We're living in an age of fear, he said. Fear of the other, fear of change, fear of losing what we have. This film is about remembering what actually matters. What actually mattered, for Richard, had clarified beautifully over 76 years. Compassion, truth, family, service, presence. Not box office numbers, not awards, not the approval of an industry that had long since moved on without him. At 76, Richard Gere had become something rare, a man at peace with his choices, even when those choices cost him everything Hollywood valued. The exile wasn't punishment anymore. It was freedom. Today, in early 2026, Richard Gere lives a life most Hollywood stars would consider unthinkable. No mansion in the Hollywood Hills, no regular appearances at industry events, no agents calling with franchise offers. Instead, mornings in Madrid, coffee on a small balcony overlooking Spanish streets, Alexander and James arguing over breakfast in a mixture of English and Spanish, Alejandra planning her day's activism work, the rhythms of ordinary family life. The best part of being here is seeing my wife happy, Richard said at the Goya Awards. The people, the food, the lifestyle, it's all wonderful. But the move to Spain isn't permanent exile. Alejandra recently revealed they plan to return to the United States eventually. We're always coming back, she told the Daily Mail. We'll live here for a few years and then come back. But we're always coming back. For now, though, Madrid offers something California never could: true privacy. Here, Richard Gere, the movie star, fades into Ricardo, the aging American who lives down the street with his young family. He walks the boys to school. He shops at local markets. He practices Spanish with patient shopkeepers who pretend not to know who he is. His net worth, estimated at $120 million, comes primarily from decades of film work. The houses, a $24 million Malibu oceanfront property, a $45 million Holland Park estate in London, sit mostly empty now. The collection of over 20 supercars, Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, Aston Martins, a Bugatti Veyron, gathers dust. The private jet flies rarely. See, I've stopped caring about things, Richard admitted. They don't bring happiness. They never did. Meanwhile, his eldest son, Homer, has begun following his father's path. At 24, Homer made a rare red carpet appearance at the premiere of The Agency, supporting his father's work. He's been cast in the upcoming series The Shards, where he'll star opposite Kaya Gerber, Cindy Crawford's daughter. 30 years after their parents' divorce, the children are working together. Richard watches Homer's career with a mixture of pride and caution. I hope he learns from my mistakes, he said quietly. I hope he understands that the work is what matters, not the fame. For Richard, legacy has taken on new meaning. He's already drafted his will, making clear that his fortune will not go to his children. Instead, it will flow into foundations supporting children's health care, creative education, and scholarships for disadvantaged youth, funds for Tibetan refugees, support for indigenous rights. "I don't want my sons to inherit money," he stated firmly. "I want them to inherit values. And I want children who begin with nothing to inherit chances I was lucky enough to have." The documentary Wisdom of Happiness, which he produced about the Dalai Lama, represents perhaps his truest legacy. Not a film about himself, but a film about what he spent 50 years learning. That happiness doesn't come from accumulation, but from compassion. Not from success, but from service. "I've had everything Hollywood offers," Richard reflected. "Fame, fortune, beautiful women, critical acclaim. And none of it, not one bit. I mattered as much as holding my son's hand while he learns to ride a bike." At 76, Richard Gere has become what he always aspired to be. Not a movie star, but a bodhisattva. Someone who uses privilege for purpose, who speaks truth regardless of cost, who understands that the greatest wealth is measured not in bank accounts, but in moments of presence. The boy from Syracuse who carried Sartre under his arm, searching for meaning, finally found it. Not in philosophy books or meditation retreats or Hollywood triumphs, but in the laughter of his children, in the smile of his wife, in the knowledge that he lived according to his deepest values, even when it cost him everything the world said mattered. Some will remember Richard Gere as the handsome leading man from Pretty Woman. Others as the activist banned from China. Still others as the Buddhist who walked away from fame. But perhaps the truest measure of Richard Gere is this. He's the man who chose presence over performance, who understood that the greatest role requires no script, who learned that real happiness comes not from the standing ovations of strangers, but from the unconditional love of two little boys who just want their father to come play. And every single day, he shows up. Richard Gere's journey teaches us something Hollywood rarely admits, that success and meaning are often opposites, that the courage to walk away is greater than the ambition to arrive. That legacy isn't built in theaters or on magazine covers, but in the quiet moments when no one is watching. He sacrificed his career for his beliefs. He chose family over fame. He traded box office glory for bedtime stories. And in doing so, he discovered what mystics have known for centuries, that happiness doesn't come from having everything, but from knowing what truly matters. What lesson will you take from Richard's journey? To speak truth even when it costs you. To choose values over validation. To understand that presence is the only gift that endures. Share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more untold stories. And remember, the greatest legacy isn't what we leave behind, but how fully we show up while we're here. Because in the end, Richard Gere reminds us that real wealth isn't measured in millions or mansions or movies. It's measured in moments, and moments are all we ever really have.